Strangers by Taichi Yamada. Translated by Wayne Lammers. Chapter 3. I ran into the woman 2 days later in the lobby. It was a rainy afternoon, and I saw her coming into the building as I stepped out from the elevator on my way to a meeting at a TV station. She carried an umbrella in one hand, and a purse and 2 or 3 bulging plastic grocery bags dangled from the other. She noticed me. "Hello," I volunteered. I was feeling apologetic. "I'm so sorry about the other night," she said with a polite bow, her voice a little squeaky. It was terribly rude of me at such a late hour. When her head came back up, I could see a tinge of embarrassment hovering about her eyes, and she seemed much prettier than before. I wasn't exactly on my best behavior either. "I'm sorry to have bothered you when you were rushing to finish a job. Please don't mention it. If you'd be so inclined, I'd like to invite you for drinks again some other time." "That's very kind of you." I'm really so embarrassed. Saying goodbye, we went our separate ways. Some leafy greens caught my eye in one of her grocery bags as I slipped past her toward the entrance. I breathed a small sigh of relief, but at the same time I felt a little bit like I'd had the wind knocked from my sails. Shortly after 10 the night before, I had made my way outside to see if there were lights in any of the third-floor windows. It was raining. I found one bright window each on the first, third, and fifth floors. No silhouettes appeared in the third-floor window. Naturally, I realized that a lit window didn't necessarily mean anything. She could easily be lying cold on the floor with her lights blazing away. I stood in the rain and watched the window for a while. In the end, I went straight back to my apartment without seeking better verification, but dire thoughts about the woman and her deep loneliness had continued to weigh on my mind. Now, after all the worry I had put myself through, a plastic grocery bag with greens peeking from its top brought me back to reality. I should have known better, I thought with a wry grin as I made my way toward the station. People aren't so eager to do themselves in most of the time. Then came the fateful day, a day in early August. I still wasn't getting out much. I didn't attend parties or go bar hopping with friends. I'd never been the gregarious type to begin with, and now the divorce proceedings and the Mamiya shock had turned me downright antisocial. When I bumped into the woman in the lobby, I'd suggested she might come over for drinks sometime, but as the days drifted by, I never quite felt like calling her. She didn't call me either. Of course, invitations like that often mean nothing more than "it's good to see you" or "it was nice talking to you." In the entertainment business, light-hearted promises and hollow assurances are as commonplace as breathing, and everybody knows they aren't intended to be taken seriously. One of these days we should go drinking when it has nothing to do with work, just for fun. For a chance to work on one of your projects, I'd turn down all other comers in a snap. There's no question about it. If something isn't done soon, the Japanese TV drama is going down the drain. Someday you and I should put our heads together and reverse that. Say, why is it I never get cast in any of your shows? I have? Oh, that's right. That was your script, wasn't it? Silly me, I'm such a doofus. I just loved that show. It was so awesome. I'd never dug so deeply into a character before, not for TV. In 18 years of making my living as a scriptwriter, I had learned not to test the sincerity of such pleasantries. My neighbor on the third floor was not in the entertainment industry, of course, but she belonged to essentially the same urban culture. I doubted she could navigate her daily existence completely free of empty compliments. And besides, suppose I did invite her to come over. What could we possibly have to talk about? I had no interest in listening to her prattle on about her work or her private life or her past. A sexual relationship might be agreeable enough if it could stop at just that, but I flinched to think of getting caught up in all of those troublesome emotions. And so to the fateful day in early August, August 4th to be exact. Late that afternoon, I picked out a necktie at a department store in Ginza. "It's for a gift," I told the 30-ish sales clerk. She selected 4 or 5 ties from inside the glass case and arranged them on the counter. They all seemed a little too dark and subdued to me, and I said so. "You did say the person was in his 40s? "Yes, late 40s. "In that case, I don't think he'd find these too subdued, but let me see." She quickly selected another 4 or 5 ties and laid them on the counter. This time her selections were so flashy I almost winced at the glare. "How about something halfway between these and those?" I said. She apparently didn't understand the sort of thing I had in mind. "Such as?" she asked. "Something that's neither too restrained nor too loud," I said as I began scanning the entire selection in the glass case myself. I soon saw that I was seeking the impossible. I was asking for something they did not have. It hit me then that my efforts to make something of the new independence I had gained were much the same. I flailed about, unable to put my finger on exactly what it was that I wanted, dissatisfied with what seemed too sober, recoiling from what seemed too wild, looking for something that simply did not exist. In the end, even though I doubted I would ever actually wear it, I left the store carrying a flashy cream-colored tie with bold swaths of orange and yellow and green splashed across it. I was disgusted with myself for having said it was a gift. A man my age giving himself a necktie for his birthday. How pathetic was that? Sentimentalism of that sort would never even have occurred to me in my younger days, and it was certainly not the kind of thing I cared for anyone to know about. Sometimes, traveling abroad, I had thought how much more my horizons might expand if I only knew the local language. I could talk easily with anyone I met. I could seduce women. But in fact, I knew that no matter how fluent I became in the language, I'd still find myself trapped in the straitjacket of my own nature, too reticent either to strike up casual conversations with strangers or to win favor with women. By the same token, getting divorced wasn't likely to expand the horizons of an over 40 television writer so terribly much. I knew this. I know that's true, and yet. I murmured quietly to myself. Evening had begun to descend on the city. The oppressive heat that had held the city in its grip since morning seemed to have left behind a thin film of grime on everything it touched. As I walked along the sidewalk bathed in the sticky air, I found myself resisting the inclination of my feet to turn directly toward home. I could see myself arriving back at the apartment and taking a shower, then sitting down to work in air-conditioned comfort for 2 or 3 hours. That would lighten my load the next day. Afterwards, I would lie back on the sofa and sip at a glass of whiskey while I watched a Fellini film or some such on video. In other words, my evening would be exactly the same as the previous. I yearned for something a little different, and not merely because it was my birthday. I realized I had sunk into a kind of depression. Somehow, I needed to pull myself out of it. I needed to get on with my new life. From that perspective, buying a necktie as a birthday present to myself represented just about the worst possible state of mind. I stopped short. Something had caught my eye, though I wasn't immediately sure what. I found myself standing before the entrance to the Ginza subway station. The sign over the descending stairway said for Shibuya and Omotesando, for Asakusa and Ueno, indicating the two directions that particular line could take me. Asakusa. That's what had brought my feet to a halt. It seemed like I hadn't seen that name in ages. Asakusa was my birthplace. That's it. I decided on the spot. I'll visit Asakusa. Now that I finally knew where I wanted to go, I trotted quickly down the stairs. Quite a few years had passed, quite possibly more than a decade, since my last trip to Asakusa. I had been born there in 1939, the first child of a sushi chef and a kitchen helper working at the same restaurant. We lived in an apartment close to the Tawaramaki subway station. My father served 2 stints in the army, one before I came along and one after. Toward the end of the war, with my father still away, my mother and I went to stay with my grandparents at her childhood home in Tachijai, north of Tokyo. Once the war ended and my father was repatriated from the Philippines in 1946, we immediately went back to live in Asakusa. My parents threw together whatever edible items they could get their hands on and sold it in the black market as vitamin stew. I was in grade school at the time, but I often helped out too. I remember watching my mother thicken the stew by mixing flour and water in a large bowl and stirring it into the great big bubbling pot. Steam from the pot billowed up around her youthful face. My father finally found regular work again as a sushi chef around the time the Korean War broke out in 1950. The shop was in Nyanbashi, but both my parents liked living in Asakusa, so we continued renting there. Our apartment was on the second floor of a tinsmith's house behind Honganji Temple. It was there that my mother became pregnant with her second child. Sadly, though, I never found out whether the baby would have been my little brother or my little sister. In January of the following year, my father was riding my mother on the back of his bicycle when a car plowed into them in front of the International Theater. Both of them died on the spot. The hit-and-run vehicle was never tracked down. My uncle in Nagoya speculated that it must have been a Jeep belonging to the American occupation, and that was why the police couldn't pursue it. But I was told at the time of the accident that they'd been hit by a black sedan. Having lost both of my parents at the age of 12, I went to live with my widowed grandfather in Aichi, in the farming village not far from Nagoya where my father had grown up. Our small acreage failed to produce enough of a harvest to take to market, so we mostly just ate what we grew. I suppose my grandfather felt sorry for me. He seldom asked me to help with the farm chores. But I worked hard at becoming a regular country boy. I knew I'd better wipe away all signs of my city upbringing as quickly as I could if I wanted to make it through the local junior high unscathed. I was orphaned again when my grandfather died in the middle of my junior year. My uncle came to dispose of the farm, and afterwards I went to live with him in Nagoya during my last year and a half of high school. For college, I returned to Tokyo. My uncle told me not to worry about a thing. He would send me the money I needed to get through school. When he passed away a number of years later, a distant relative who came for the funeral suggested that he had cheated me by sending me far less than I was entitled to. But I found it hard to imagine that my grandfather's meager lands had sold for a particularly large sum, so I have never questioned my uncle's generosity. The passengers thinned out considerably at Nyanbashi, and more got off at Kanda and Ueno. By the time the subway reached the end of the line at Asakusa, only 3 or 4 passengers remained in each car. I climbed the stairs that led in the direction of Kaminaraman Gate and emerged into the thickening dusk. Contrary to what I had anticipated from the emptiness of the train, I found the streets and lanes in the area brightly lit and bustling with pedestrians. After passing through the massive gate, I strolled between the shops flanking the approach to Sensoji Temple. I was okay with visiting the temple and the entertainment district immediately to its west, but I remained reluctant to extend my tour to those sections of Asakusa most intimately linked with my childhood memories. In all my previous visits, I had never once turned my steps toward the International Theater or the streets around Honganji Temple or Tawaramaki Station. This being Tokyo, I knew that no matter how far removed they might be from the center of Asakusa, those neighborhoods could not possibly look much like they had more than 30 years ago, and yet I remained fearful of venturing into them. I dreaded, for example, what might happen if I were to find still standing the tinsmith's place where my parents and I had spent our last days and months together. The emotions I had dammed up inside me all these years might come bursting through the floodgates in an uncontrollable deluge. I had allowed myself few tears since my parents' death when I was 12. But if I were to walk again along the streets and lanes I had known as a child and in doing so came upon something that vividly reminded me of my time with my parents there, it could snap every last cord binding the armor that had been protecting me. I could be stripped naked and collapse in a blubbering mass of tears. Grow up and stop whining. I chided myself. Besides, you know perfectly well that the International Theater gave way to a large modern hotel ages ago. Dropping a 100 yen coin into the offering box at the front of the temple, I put my hands together and closed my eyes. A flash of light enveloped me, and when I turned to look, I saw an elderly Caucasian man lower his camera, watching me a little nervously as if worried he might have offended me. I smiled and nodded at him, and he seemed relieved. He said something in English and waved his hand. I left the grounds through a side entrance near the temple's main hall. The pedestrians were far fewer here, and so were the lights. As I headed in the direction of the movie theaters, a man sidled up to me and matched his steps with mine. "Looking for a good time, mister?" he asked in a raspy voice. "No thanks, I'm on business." I looped back to the street in front of the ward office and stopped for some supper at a Neil restaurant. It was past 7:30 by the time I finally set foot in the theater district. A forlorn air hung about the area. 7 or 8 theaters remained in business, but the street was nearly deserted. Given the hour, perhaps this was to be expected, since the last shows of the day would already have begun. But I also remembered how empty the streets had been even at midday the last time I came, and that made me wonder if the place always had the atmosphere of an old forgotten byway these days. Suddenly a tall, brightly lit building loomed before me. With a small plaza out front that set it back from the street, it seemed to materialize out of nowhere. It had not been there on my last visit. Housing a variety of specialty shops, the building would have fit right in Shibuya or Kichijoji or any other bustling shopping district, but it seemed rather out of place in its actual surroundings. It clashed sharply with the shabby old structures nearby, creating the impression that a building belonging to an altogether different dimension had somehow gotten plunked down in that spot by mistake. To me, this bright, sanitized building was a greater scar upon the townscape than the closed and boarded-up theaters or the bare lots that remained where buildings had been torn down. I suspected, though, that this impression was destined to fade as the entire area transformed itself to match the style of this new building. Another pimp sidled up to me. "Got a real cutie, mister. Only 18. Great ass. I just finished." "Ah, very good, sir. Please come again." The unexpected politeness of his response made me turn to look at him. I was surprised to see him flash me a friendly smile as he backed away. Most of the time when you told the pimps who approached you like this that you weren't interested, they turned away without a second glance, so I had not expected him to still be looking at me. Not only that, I was disarmed by his smile, which contained no hint of the I bet sarcasm such men typically showed, and I found myself instinctively smiling back. A moment later, I halted my steps. I realized that if I proceeded all the way to the end of the street where it ran into the Toei Cinema, I would see the International Theater off to the left. Or rather, I would see the high-rise hotel that the International Theater had been torn down to make way for. I wanted to avoid that. I decided to turn back. As a child, I had not actually seen much of the International Theater's famous high-kicking line dancers, of course, but the building had loomed large as a backdrop to my daily comings and goings until the age of 12. And the final memory of my childhood in Asakusa was the sight of my parents' blood staining the pavement of the wide boulevard that ran in front of the theater, a short distance down the street toward the Tawaramaki subway station. The next time I stopped, I was standing in front of the Asakusa Variety Hall. The comic monologue then in progress was being piped outside through a speaker by the entrance. The doors were still open, but no one was going in. I was the only person who even paused at the entrance. I pictured the hall within to be sparsely filled. It might be fun to take in an act or two before heading home. Because of the late hour, admission had been reduced from 1,500 yen to 1,000 yen. To my considerable surprise, the hall was packed. Even the stools set up for additional seating were mostly taken, and a number of people were standing. I would never have anticipated such a lively, charged atmosphere from the way the place had looked outside. Laughter erupted from the audience in great bursts as the young raconteur milked every comic nuance from his narrative. The monologue went on for another 4 or 5 minutes before concluding to a rousing ovation. As the clapping began to taper off, an announcement came over the speakers. Members of the Shopkeepers Association and the Dove Tours Group are asked to please return to your buses now. All at once, the vast majority of the audience got to its feet and began crowding into the aisles to make for the doors. As a television writer, I, too, performed for an audience, in effect, but I had never had to witness this kind of exodus. Watching the audience depart as though nothing could stop them was like seeing my worst nightmare come true. The orchestra struck up some music to announce the beginning of the next act, and a new raconteur appeared. Even after he had taken his place on the cushion at center stage, the departing patrons still clogged the aisles, pressing for the exits. "Thank you so much for coming," the mid-50ish storyteller cried after them in a high-pitched voice. The audience, still seated, laughed. "Yes, indeed. That's the way out, folks. So please hurry, hurry, hurry to your buses. Thank you so much for coming." Collapsing nearly prostrate, he repeated with faint sobs in his voice, "Thank you so much for coming." The exodus continued unabated. Right that way, folks. That's the way out for those who wish to depart. He put on a show of weeping and sticking his tongue out in chagrin. "I worshipped of tours," he cried. "When you get back home, please be sure to brag to your friends that you caught a glimpse of me too." The hall finally fell silent again. The remaining audience was sparse. "Dove tours can be so cruel," the performer sighed. "This is just between you and me now," he said, lowering his voice secretively, "but Dove Tours gets those folks in for half price. 750 yen per person. So before you go getting too stoked about the turnout, you have to remind yourself that it takes two of them to be worth a full admission." And then they hop up and walk out on you like that, without a moment's pause or regret. They hear the call to their buses and boom, boom, boom. It's a stampede for the doors. I can't stand it. I'm sorry, but to tell you the unvarnished truth, I can't stand Dove Tours. He intended this all in jest, of course, but it came off sounding a bit too serious, and an awkward tension filled the air. Then a voice broke the silence. "They're still here, you know." My heart skipped a beat. The raconteur grew flustered. "No, you're pulling my leg, right? It's not true, is it?" "Just kidding," the same voice said. The audience burst into laughter. "Why, you dirty scoundrel, you." Now, that was cruel. My liver stopped pumping. No, I mean my heart, not my liver. Of Tours, I'll have you know. Honestly, I do. I'm their biggest fan. Good grief. You shouldn't go around teasing people about matters of life and death. It's Dove Tours that puts the victuals on my table. The lead-up to his monologue was turning into quite a rap session. I don't reckon I should be mouthing off to those of you who stayed behind, but it's a big-time bummer to get up here on stage and see 3/4 of the audience hiking toward the doors. Makes you want to pack up and go right on home yourself. I rose from my stool at the back of the hall and moved to a seat several rows forward. "Hey there, mister. Don't scare me like that," the performer said, looking directly at me. "Did ya really have to get up just when I thought I'd managed to patch the breach in the dike? I was about ready to run down there and grab you by the sleeve and beg you not to go until I realized you were actually coming forward. Thank you very much. Please, by all means, make your way down front. No need to stop there. Come right on down where you can feel my spit fly." The audience was laughing again, some watching the man on stage, some looking at me. At that point, the raconteur steered his unbroken chatter toward a new topic. He started poking fun at some television celebrities. I had not changed seats to get a better view of the act. In fact, I had no good reason to change seats at all. It was a silly thing to do. Though I did not immediately look in his direction, I had changed seats to get a better angle on the man who'd said, "They're still here, you know." From my previous spot, I'd been able to see only the back of his head. The man's voice and his rear profile had reminded me uncannily of my father, of my dead father. And for that reason, a sudden impulse had taken hold of me to move to where I could see the man from the side. But so, what if the man did remind me of my father? What was the big deal? My father died at the age of 39, so if he were alive today, he would be 75. Had something about a man of that age reminded me of him, my behavior might have made more sense, but this character looked like he must still be in his 30s. There was something just a little off-kilter about my response. To avoid drawing any more attention to myself than I already had, I made a point of laughing along with the rest of the audience, but I heard almost nothing the raconteur was saying. I wanted desperately to turn and look at the man. His voice had sounded astonishingly like my father's, and his bearing from behind had looked heart-wrenchingly like images of my father that remained etched in my mind. That was why I so wanted to see his face. I wanted to see it and assure myself that he did not really look so much like my father in the end. After all, no one could resemble my father in every respect. I sought the healthy dose of disappointment that would quiet my racing heart. The monologue came to a close. I turned to look at the man. It was my father. Or rather, it was a man whose profile was the spitting image of my father at the time of his death. Wow, I thought, quickly looking away. I'd never have believed that two different people could look so much alike. The orchestra signaled the start of the next act, and a husband and wife juggling team swept onto the stage. I could not find the courage to look toward the man again. I'd seen him for no more than a second, I noted to myself. Plus, I wasn't really all that close. What basis did a glance give me for judging how much of a likeness there might be? The man would probably look completely different if I saw him from the front. That sort of thing happened all the time. Now I felt like I just had to see him from the front, and I could hardly contain myself. But I knew perfectly well it would be pointless. There was no way my father could be walking around Asakusa today. On stage, the husband was balancing a ball on the tip of a cane, which was in turn balanced on his forehead. He stepped left, then took several quick steps to the right to keep the ball and cane from falling. As I followed him across the stage with my eyes, I stole another peek at the man. He was looking back at me. My heart stopped. The man smiled and dipped his head in a little nod. My flesh went cold. Averting my eyes, I stared at the floor and tried to quell my extreme agitation. Why would he be looking at me? Why would he smile and nod as if he knew me? But of course, it was because the storyteller had given me such a hard time when I switched seats a while ago. Something had probably reminded him of that and made him wonder how the guy who got needled was doing, and our eyes met when he looked my way. The smile meant nothing more than an offhand, enjoying the show. He just happened to be an amiable sort of guy. The pimp who came up to me outside seemed like an affable fellow, too. That's what's nice about Asakusa. You can still run into people like that around here. At any rate, now that I'd actually seen the man's face, what was the verdict? Well, how was I to know? My father died when I was 12. I could hardly claim a precise recall of every little nook and cranny of his face. Sure, he looked like my father, but just how much had to remain open to question. All I could really say was that he was the spitting image of my father as my increasingly vague memory, with the help of some old photographs, had pictured him through the years. He was a dead ringer. Even when our eyes met, I could have sworn I was looking at my father. Yet, that did not alter the fact that he could in no way actually be my father. The juggling act concluded to tepid applause. So why was I getting so worked up over nothing? By now, he probably thought I was a strange one, too. He'd offered me a smile, and my only response was to turn my eyes away. He might even be feeling a little offended. "Yo," I heard a voice say very close by. I looked up to find the man standing in the aisle at the end of my row. "What do you say we get out of here?" he said. "Are you talking to me?" My voice trembled. He was indeed the living image of my father. He started for the door without waiting for me to respond. His receding figure betrayed not the slightest doubt that I would follow. The orchestra signaled the beginning of another act. I rose from my seat and hurried after the man.